Hello again. In this video, I'm going to show you the process I used for designing and illustrating a revolver that I'm working on for a personal project. I've done a few of these in the past days, and so I'm pretty much aware of where I'm going with the design. Well, not the shape of the gun, but where I'm going with the perspective and with the type of sketch that I'm doing. So you see me build those ellipses there. Those are going to be the basis for my cylinders, both for the barrel and for the holder of the bullets, which honestly I don't know the name. Not the barrel, but the magazine, is it? I don't know. So I'm doing a few details already with the iron sights, and it's just because it's the first element that I can use to define a look or define a sort of a feel for the gun. Mind you, especially for the gun buffs here, this is not going to be in any way a realistic depiction of a gun. Now, there's a problem here. I was drawing in the background layer, so what I do is I auto levels my layer so that I get black and white, and then I go into the channels and I control click the channel, anyone, to get a selection of the sketch, and then I just flood fill that selection on a new layer, and that enables me to separate, because I'll be needing to paint underneath. Now the cross sections that I did there with these sort of hooks around the barrel, these are making the barrel look flat because they are flat, and if they're wrapping around a circular shape, they should be circular. And eventually I realize what I'm doing. Also, I'm not providing enough space. So here we go. I realize that the shapes are wrong, and I just paint over them. And again, it's important to draw through. Even if you don't want to mess up your drawing, just make sure that the lines are good. Now this is not by far my best line work of this set of guns that I've been working on, but it does its job, right? It holds the perspective, it holds the shapes, and the cleanest you can get the line work, obviously the better it will be, the better the final drawing will be. Also, some of these details here, I'm really not sure if I actually need those. I think these are probably an issue of weight for the gun, that you probably don't need to have those, but those are very recognizable. So this is a very core element of designing something that looks like again, is it a bullet holder? It's like the bullet pocket or something. I'm going to call it the magazine anyway, but hopefully you guys know what I'm referring to. So the handle here, I'm really designing any shape I like. I changed the iron sights to give it a slight curve because I thought the previous ones were very modern, too modern looking anyway. And here I'm just adding sort of a clamp over the gun, honestly, just for the sake of just having it have a little bit more detail. And here I'm adding some sort of pin to act as an axle for the thing to spin. Oh man, why did I start talking about the gun without knowing the name of the thing? And adding detail really is just for me to later on have something to paint, because if you have a flat surface, not only does it not become very interesting when it's shaded, but also there's not a lot of places where you can put highlights and shadows for you to sort of suggest volume. Also, this is a gun that someone is going to hold in VR, and I really want people to look at the gun and feel that it has a lot of detail, because this is something that we've experienced testing the demo of the game, is that the first thing people do is they look at the gun. They like looking at the gun because they're testing whether or not the device recognizes that they can twist their hands. This detail that I'm adding here at the tip is just to sort of balance out the shape. I really like guns which have details that are either decorative or that don't really add anything, but they make it look cool. I know that looking cool is very subjective. What I think is cool might not be what other people think is cool, but having detail, that is not so subjective as feeling that it looks cool or not. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually creating enough elements for people to look and to sort of appreciate. Even if they think it's ugly, at least it's something that they can look at. I mean, something for everyone, right? Even for people who just like to complain. Also, I'm adding a harder outline here on my drawing, because I'm going to tell you the technique that I use to do the shape of the selection. So what I do is I make a really hard outline, and then I select everything outside the gun. I pick this box, and then I remove with my magic wand. I alt click to remove from the selection. There's also the issue of the pit there for the handle, for the trigger, sorry. And I start by adding a dark gradient right there. And this is just for me to have enough colors to pick from, right? And when you have something that is volume and you want it to follow a certain light source, I usually do either a light cube, which you've probably seen me do in the Bad North pixel art mockup in honor of Steven Spielberg, Oscar Starbuck, that is. And what I do here is a barrel, and I'm shading that so that I have reference for shades, right? So later on, if a face is, if a certain surface is facing a certain way, then I know which shade to pick from that cylinder. And that's quite helpful if you're not really comfortable in maintaining sort of a notion of what colors you're using or what the values you're using. So I'm doing this if it's a very non-illustrative approach. This is more like a concept art approach in which I want to sell the idea of volume before I care about colors, right? So I know that all the surfaces that I'm painting are facing light in a certain direction, and that helps me pick which value to paint those surfaces with. So the top surfaces, of course, are going to be brighter because they're facing the upwards direction of the light. And you get a notion that the light is upwards because I've added that gradient before. So you know that if it's on the bottom, it should be darker because it's further away from the light source. If it's on the top, then it should be brighter. So the handles got a little bit of detail. Handles are very difficult because they're supposed to be slightly smooth unless you really want to go in and do slits for the fingers. I actually made this one to be slightly smooth. Now the part of the barrel here and the part of the revolving thing, I don't really know that the idea of it being shiny is selling that well at this point, right? But I still want to put the light in because I want to be sure that I remember that those points need light. So I took the lines away here for you guys to be able to see what it looks like without the line work. It's slightly messy, but it's getting there. So the lines are very important in this type of illustration because, again, this is just concept art. This is not like a final illustration. This is not a promo painting. And what I'm doing here is I'm going back to the line art layer, and I'm locking the opacity in that layer, and I'm painting white in the lines that are in outlines, that are inlines, so to speak. So lines that are facing the light source, or lines that are on an edge that is facing the light source, right? So they get a highlight. And by doing that, I'm actually able to transmit or to sort of convey the volume of that area a little bit better because the lines are now helping me show that that bit is not shade. If that line isn't shaded, it means it's poking out, right? And that helps sort of read the rest of the shape as well. But again, keeping in mind of where the faces are facing, you know, and fixing things up. At this point, I think I already have an extra layer on top of my line work. And this is the layer where when I'm getting to the final phase, the layer I use to do slight cleanups and highlights in certain spots. So I'll be painting over the line work if I need to, but I'll also be sort of like there, I'll be adding a little bit more lines where I want to really create an overlap. Because again, concept art, it's important that it reads, important that someone who in this case will be me, but if it's a big team and there's someone else who's going to model this in 3D, then you want to be able to give them the least amount of trouble interpreting a drawing. And in this case, I'm trying to not only keep this clear for me, but I'm enjoying the illustrations. I'm also having fun doing this, and because there's no time pressure for me to do this, I'm doing this in my own time, and so I can actually enjoy the illustration of it and putting tiny details and kind of figuring out whether or not I like this. So I'm color coding here my layers just for a matter of keeping track of where things are. So the red one is the base shaded layer. The yellow one is the line work, and I'm thinking I'm messing up because I'm painting light on the line work, so that's stupid me again. And the green one is the like detail pass at the top. And the problem with keeping things in different layers is that later on I'm going to actually use the dodge and burn tool to highlight some of the details on the barrels. And it's not going to be easy because there's shading on 3 different layers. And because of that, I go through the trouble of actually having to match the shading I did, or the burn, or is it the dodge? Yeah, having to match the amount of dodge that I used in one layer on the other ones as well. Again, the detail there on the bullet pocket. In Portugal we call it a drum. I'm not sure if it's the same name in the States, or by the people who made the gun, which in this case I don't think it refers to any sort of real gun in the real world. I mean, I pick and choose elements that I like from real world guns, but I'm not really following any sort of I mean, someone who really understands Afghan is probably looking at this and cringing, and I'm sorry for that. I just really want to do something that's just visually exciting. And so a lot of the details are made up, completely made up. Some of these probably don't even work mechanically, but I'm sort of serving myself for my design degree, hoping that I'm not making those too many mistakes that will probably embarrass my ex-teachers. So this is a stage, again, here's the dodge. It just highlights the barrel a little bit more, just makes it more metallic. If you want to make something that looks more metallic, you really want to up the contrast. I'm making some color layers here, and this is what Max Grak calls the flats. Also, if you don't know who Max Grak is, I demand you go online and search for the guy. He's an amazing illustrator. And what I'm doing is I'm creating layers with flat shapes of color. And these flat shapes of color, I'll then change that layer to color. And because this is black and white and has a fairly decent range of shades, just the color effect in layers actually works. So I'm not too worried about keeping this in a different style. I make this big selection with a lasso tool, and then I turn the base shape into a mask, and you can see the tiny little icon on the mask on the right there. And by doing that, I keep my color within that base shape of the mask. I could also do a clipping mask, but because the layer was just there, like it was more readily available. I'm also dodging a little bit here on the gray, just to make that bit a little bit more either metallic or more polished. And I'm doing that in some of these surfaces as well, just to make them look polished. I'm guessing that the hammer would be polished. I mean, your finger is going to be on that all the time, so I'm guessing the user would have ended up polishing that. And because all of these weapons are supposed to be some sort of esoterical or weird weapons, what I'm doing is I'm adding a fire effect. This is supposed to be the version of the gun that has either fire ammo or does fire damage, or at least is really high energy, right? So what I'm doing is I'm simulating that there's a lot of light coming from the inside of the gun, and it's reflecting off of some of these metal pieces. And the way I'm doing that is I'm just picking the faces, again, the same trick, picking the faces that are facing the light source and making those way, way, way brighter. And playing with this sort of range of colors. You can't actually see the palette that I'm using to pick these from, but I'm using Photoshop's swatches to pick these colors from, right? So the colors are laying on the screen. It's just the capture didn't get it, but I'm using that to pick the colors and gradually make them from this like burgundy or this sort of like really dark red into a bright yellow, a bright orange, and then a bright yellow, because it's sort of like the way color temperature works. I'm also taking that color or that sort of range of colors, and I'm painting the edge there, again, just to suggest not only that edge is getting some reflective light, but also that edge is slightly rounded, right? Because if it was a sharp edge, you wouldn't be able to see that. But guns get worked to sharp points, but very rarely in the real world is an edge perfectly sharp. And because I'm missing some of this light, I would like to have more light of that. I'm actually having light poke through the trigger hole down to the trigger guard, I think it's called, and that just adds a little bit more interest, I think, to the whole shape. Now this didn't clean up to do, and what I'm doing here is I'm trying to get this handle to look polished. So I'm designing. I'm guessing. A reflective light going down the handle. Now, of course, this is too bright, and now what I do is I smudge it a little bit with the smudge tool, which is something that most people tell beginners not to use, because it's a crutch for shading, right? You want to use the smudge tool when you know what you're doing, right? Or when you're comfortable with what you're doing. You don't want to use it at the beginning, for doing a couple of dabs with paint and then smudge your way into shading. That really doesn't work as you expect. I'm also experimenting here with the bottom color, and I notice that my shape is slightly bigger than the color, so I get the shape from that layer, I invert the selection, and I expand it a little so that I can then delete and crop away a few pixels off of that base shape so that it gets thinner and falls within the shapes of the highlights. I'm also going to do a little trick here, which is just to copy and paste all these layers into a gray version, blur that out, and use that gray version as a screen layer to bring out some of the highlights and actually make them sort of flood off to the background. So I think I copy everything here and make it black and white, blur it, and then bring the levels up so that we only get the highlights, and then just keep that as a screen and you can see some of the highlights poking out. And this is the final result. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you learned something from it. So take care.